hit a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now.
Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it.
Performing an evasive maneuver.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Failure to Launch, a space history podcast where we take you through every mistake, failure, and explosion that made modern space exploration possible. I am your host, Quinn.
I'm Chris.
And I am a representation of Chris.
And this is the Cosmos 954 episode. All right, so today I actually wanted to talk about something that hits a number of my interests. And I think particularly you, Chris, this will interest you as well. So for me, this ticks the boxes of lesser-known space disasters, the Soviet Union, nuclear physics, and my home country of Canada. I suspect for you, it's going to hit the interest of submarines, and lots of them.
Yeah, we love
I hope
submarines.
so.
You didn't even need to specify which Chris. This is a Chris squared interest.
It works for either of them. You play that game you play. At some point, maybe we'll start a Twitch channel. Who knows? Yeah. Have you guys ever heard of a satellite called Cosmos 954?
No.
I'll be honest, I
Give me
have
something.
heard of it, but I haven't heard about what it does because I've heard about it vaguely once in a while through, Wikipedia adventures at 1 a.m.
Okay. Yeah. So this is kind of one of those topics that's not quite memory hold, like it was in the news way back when, but it's also not something that's really made like a lasting impression on history, which I do think it should have. And that's what we're going to talk about, because Cosmos 954 was a nuclear reactor falling from orbit and contaminating an area of Canada larger than Maine.
Yeah, that sounds like a Soviet
Bit
thing.
of a spoiler up front. Probably something people should remember.
I mean, what is it? The United States had a series of reactor experiments. I think it was the Snaptran series, where the United States kind of proved that if things go wrong, spaceborne reactors can contaminate a large area.
That is also something I want to talk about with this episode series. So what's going to happen is this first episode is going to be about the satellite, the Cosmos 954 satellite, as well as the satellite program that it was part of, and the initial American and Canadian response to the satellite. The second episode, we're going to get into the actual crash, the cleanup, the political ramifications, but I also do want to spend some time talking at the end about the ethics and practicalities of using nuclear energy in space. And by that, I mean like actual nuclear reactors, because I believe there is a lot to talk about there. Also, I know that the last 5 episodes we've done have been about the Soviet Union. Listener, do not worry. They're not going to be the sole focus of this podcast or even this episode, really, because the story of 954 is one where a lot of countries made mistakes. The Soviets for making this big flying death trap, and the Canadians and Americans for their horrible response and cleanup. As well as that, the main source for this series is a book called Operation Morning Light. This was written by a Canadian journalist named Leo Heaps, who followed the story of the satellite and the cleanup, which is where he got the name. The cleanup operation was called Operation Morning Light. And I'm actually going to take the step here of not recommending anyone who is interested buying his book, because it is a very good source of technical info, but it's also cartoonishly racist and dismissive towards the First Nations people of the Northwest Territories, who, as we'll learn, were the victims of a nuclear disaster. Long story short, Leo Heaps, good investigative journalist, racist piece of shit. Glad he died a year before I was born. Glad I never shared the earth with him.
How do we know that this isn't just like your karmatic rebirth and your Leo Heaps?
Oh God. I don't want. I don't want to.
Why would you
I don't
curse
want
him
to.
like
Why would
that?
you say that? I don't want to consider. Oh,
Look, I
Good job.
saw two connectable points. You were just like, oh, he died a year before I was born. Well, it's a pipeline, right?
Oh yeah, and
he
sure.
was Canadian. I was Canadian. I'm now finishing the work that he started in a hopefully less racist way.
Oh, and so I should be happy that I was born in the same year that the fucking Berlin Wall fell.
Take this to a let's take this to its logical conclusion.
I share a birthday with
maybe you're
Shakespeare.
Gorbachev. I know. Yeah, maybe you are the
Tear
spirit of that
down
wall,
this wall.
and now you build weapons of war.
I do not do that directly in any capacity.
You're a cog in the machine, as are we all.
Cosmos 954 and nuclear reactors in space.
So, real quick, right off the bat, to avoid any confusion going forward, almost all Soviet and Russian satellites get a Cosmos number. That doesn't actually really indicate anything about the satellite, they just count up. As a general rule, if it was a military satellite or it orbited the Earth, it got a Cosmos number. For example, Cosmos 936 was a biosat carrying fruit flies and rats, while Cosmos 959 was a target dummy for anti-satellite missiles. The most recent flight was Cosmos 2557, which launched on July 7th, 2022. So just a few weeks before we were recording this.
There's been a lot of Cosmoses.
Yeah,
at least
that's
one
the
of
thing.
them
Like
has rats. Our favorite science animal.
If you
a
think
lot
about
of
it,
them actually did.
if you think about it, Cosmos is almost like it's basically a serial number system.
It is.
If you know the Cosmos number, then you can get exactly what it does and what its orbit is, and it's all of its information basically.
How many live rats are on board? How many passengers?
That's all contained right there in the number.
They have cheese from the moon.
We need to save them, all of them.
Yes. So at some point we are actually going to be talking about the biosats. That's going to be the episode titled "How PETA Killed a Space Program," which I'm very excited about. And since 954, the subject of our episode, was a military satellite, it got a Cosmos number 2. Now, as for what the satellite actually was, it was part of a series of spy satellites confusingly called US-A. Because I can see that getting very confusing very quickly, I'm just going to call it by its Western name, RORSAT, for Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite. Anyway, these were radar satellites designed to detect and track American ships. Now, this wasn't just to make sure the Soviets knew where they were, but also to pass their locations on to Soviet ships and submarines. Now, remember with the Sputnik episodes how we talked about Khrushchev gutting the Soviet Navy and scrapping all of their big impressive ships?
Yes.
Oh, trust me, I remember that.
Who needs
kind of hard
ships
to,
when you have missiles?
Because what was it? 1/3 of the Russian Navy or so was just completely kicked out from under them.
So it was. I'll go kind of rapid fire here. It was a third of their budget got slashed. 2.3 million men got fired, and like ships that had both just like big battle cruisers that had just been finished and aircraft carriers that were in progress were scrapped. And yeah, like Chris said there, that's all just because I love it. Like, this is something you don't find in any other history, is that everything comes back to Sputnik. What we're going to talk about today is a direct consequence of Korolev selling Khrushchev so hard on satellites that he just completely fucks the Soviet military for decades to come. And as we'll talk about, this is still Russian military doctrine. Like, they're still stuck with this.
It is the ultimate consequence of the used car salesman strategy.
Everything comes back to Korolev selling a moron really, really hard, of Khrushchev getting rocket pilled.
Rocket pilled.
While we can point at things like, the Moskva or things like that, it's not necessarily like, that's not necessarily to say that these doctrines were bad by any means. That there is a lot of merit to them, but it's just because of those cuts that Khrushchev made, the Soviet Navy had to get creative if they were going to stay a credible, if they were going to stay a real navy. So the Soviet solution was to shift away from big expensive ships and towards submarines, destroyers, and patrol boats, all packed to the brim with long-range cruise missiles. Because guess what? The boss likes missiles now.
And the entire theory was, I'm pretty sure I'm correct here, but a flurry of missiles and a flurry of casualties, then back to port, rearm, and sort you out.
So the idea was, like, if the Soviets couldn't go toe-to-toe with American aircraft carriers, they just drowned them in volleys of missiles. And if those ships had defenses to shoot down the missiles, they'd have even more missiles to launch to just completely overwhelm the defenses. To give you an idea, one of the earliest Soviet cruise missiles was the P-5 Pyaturka, which just means fiver in Russian, known to NATO as the SS-N3 Shattuck. The Soviets slapped this missile on their Whiskey, Echo, and Juliet-class submarines, as well as the Cresta and Kinda-class cruisers. I'm probably pronouncing some of those wrong. Anyway, for a grand total of 67 vessels packing this missile. And even like when the Soviets got around to building aircraft carriers like the Kiev and Kuznetsov classes, they still packed them full of cruise missiles. On the video right now, we'll have a good picture, like the Kuznetsov, the aircraft carrier that everyone loves to make fun of. On its flight deck, there are missile tubes that they can open up because the thing is technically a missile cruiser that just happens to carry aircraft.
And that is, I have to say, something that is not, it's simply not normal for an aircraft carrier to have that heavy of an offensive punch, not just through its aircraft wing, but by itself. It could have its entire aircraft wing removed and it would still have that striking capacity, which is unusual.
So part of this is actually because of like treaty requirements. Like there's some kind of thing where aircraft carriers aren't allowed to go through a certain strait, but missile cruisers are. So by making it technically not an aircraft carrier, then they can kind of get around that.
I don't know. Everything there just sounds horrible.
You do know stuff.
I'd never want to go on a vacation to the Admiral Kuznetsov control room.
But
I would want to for a day, and then I would want to go home and get like decontaminated, like in one of those disease movies where I have to like hold up my arms and get sprayed with foam. So they adopt this model, but the Soviet model also had some weaknesses. The biggest of these was actually controlling the missiles, because they could fly further than the ship's radar could see. To know where their targets were, they needed reconnaissance. Now, the first way the Navy tried to solve this problem was just to mount big radars on bombers and have them go out and hunt for American ships. This worked, but these bombers were also at a huge risk of being shot down by those same ships. So the Soviets needed a recon option that couldn't get blown out of the sky. And this is also this is right around the time that militaries around the world are starting to look at satellites as like an actual option. See, up until this point, satellites had mostly just been restricted to science and propaganda, like the Sputniks 1, 2, and 3, like we talked about. But the generals realized that putting something in orbit made it very hard to knock out. Not impossible, but just like it made it mostly out of reach of another military. This is also like the main reason why spy satellites start becoming a thing. So the Soviets start looking at like radar satellites. The Americans are the first to put spy satellites up. And the reason they do is because all of their spy planes suddenly become vulnerable. New Soviet surface-to-air missiles start shooting down U-2s, and the CIA decides like, hey, we need something that can't get shot down. The Soviets needed a satellite that could track ships and guide missiles to them. So they developed the Rorsats and kitted out each of them with a massive 10-meter-long radar system. This allowed them to track even small ships, but it also ate a massive amount of power to run. Another problem was that for the radar to get the best results, it needed to be in a very shallow orbit. Like, I mean, an incredibly shallow orbit. So shallow that even using solar panels would make enough drag to deorbit the satellite in a matter of days. These problems were big enough that they made the Soviets pick a new power source never before used in space: nuclear reactors. In order to talk about that, I think it's important to make a distinction right off the bat. So nuclear power is actually not that uncommon in space. A lot of satellites, especially a lot of rovers, use generators that are called radioisotope thermoelectric generators, or RTGs. Basically, these are just like a little stack of nuclear fuel surrounded by heat sinks, and they work by something called the Seebeck effect. I'm not an electrical engineer, so don't completely take my word on this. But basically, whenever you have a temperature difference between two conductors, you also get a voltage difference. So whenever you have hot nuclear fuel and the cold vacuum of space, between those two, you wind up with a voltage difference, and you can sort of like trickle charge a satellite or a rover with that. And the main benefit is that you can use them wherever, and they last as long as you have nuclear fuel, as it slowly decays. but they also have problems. The first is that RTGs aren't very efficient. They weigh a lot for how much power they actually produce. Because of this, the most common profile for RTGs is anything where you need like a low amount of consistent power over a long period of time.
Nuclear power is one of, like you were talking about, is extremely consistent power, but in the capacity of space exploration, it's not going to be high power whatsoever, or high output.
One of the most common uses for RTGs is actually deep space probes.
Where you can't count on light.
Yeah. Like, also, just like the further you get from the sun, the less energy you get. That's just the rule of solar panels. So, like the Voyager satellites going all the way out of the solar system, those need to have RTGs. Exactly. And another use is actually rovers, especially if you want that rover to operate at night, because guess what? If you have a planet between you and the sun, you're not going to be driving anywhere.
Or if you have a planet with a borderline impenetrable atmosphere, congratulations, you can have a.
If you're on Venus, you have other problems.
No, I'm talking about not
like Titan, or
not through absurd what's it called heat, but through insane cloud cover, where
I guess that's
solar
fair.
panels aren't going to work. Then you could have an RTG driving Stirling generators, or what's it called, the ones you were talking about. I can't remember. The reason I remember Stirling generators is that was my senior project in university.
Ooh, neat.
You heard it here first, folks. Journey to the center of Saturn.
Now, all of that is not what we're talking about today. Cosmos 954 and the other Vorsats were a unique case. Like I said earlier, they operated in low Earth orbit but couldn't rely on solar panels. RTGs wouldn't have worked because they couldn't generate enough power to feed the radar systems. The solution was simple. Each Vorsat was launched with a full-on miniaturized nuclear reactor. The design they came up with was called the BES-5. Each reactor would launch with around 50 kilos of enriched nuclear fuel. Unfortunately, this fuel was also hyper-refined. See, the Soviets picked a type of reactor called a fast neutron reactor. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this because guess what? I am not a nuclear physicist. But basically, the main upshot of a fast neutron reactor is that you don't need to use a neutron moderator like water or graphite. Since water is very heavy and expensive to launch into space, it made sense to the Soviets to remove it from the design completely and save launch costs. Now, like, from an engineering point of view, these are all very good reasons to pick a fast neutron reactor for launching into space. But they also had a downside. In order to get the higher energy, the thing that makes the fast neutrons fast, the nuclear fuel in the reactor has to be a lot more pure than normal. For context, and if you're on YouTube, we'll have a little thing up, a little graph for you. Most power-generating reactors use uranium enriched to around 5%. Research reactors use around 20% enriched uranium. And depending on the kind of reactor, like if you're using a CANDU design, you can even get away with less than 1%. Do you guys want to guess how enriched the uranium on Cosmos 954 was?
The amount that you said, hyper-enriched, sounds terrifying.
The only reference I have for hyper-enriched is starting to get into the stuff they're putting into probably alpha reactors, so upwards of 75.
90%
That is probably bomb-worthy.
Which, yeah, you're right. Which, by the way, this is literally weapons grade. I am not exaggerating. You could take the fuel from this satellite and build a nuclear bomb in your garage.
We're just going
You'd have enough,
We're going to float our satellite around, and if it deorbits and just sprays radioactive goop everywhere, we don't care.
Yeah. Like I said, this is weapons grade fuel. They didn't get this stuff made specially. Like, the Soviets have their weapons production at this time. The scientists just went to a weapons production site and just like took whatever uranium was next on the list. Like it was sectioned out into like, all right, this is for a bomb, this is for a bomb, this is for a satellite. What the fuck? Yeah, so like every one of them launched with around 45 kilos of uranium-235, which is the important part of the uranium.
Highly enriched uranium.
You would have enough to make a nuclear bomb as well. Like 45 kilos in Cosmos 954. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima had 51 kilos of U-235.
Just because you touched a spicy rock and you don't feel good doesn't mean you can't come into work.
I've watched the Chernobyl miniseries. I know how this works.
Yeah, you get a bad sunburn, you bleed a little bit, and then you come in the next day.
Yeah, except here's the thing, because these are fast neutron reactors, they don't even have the graphite. They don't have water. It's just uranium. And it's uranium at 90% enrichment, again, literally weapons grade. Like this, and that is on the high end of weapons grade. I'm not.
No, that
it makes as an engineer, when I know that space, especially early on, was like, you have to conserve every single little bit of mass. I understand, but Jesus fucking Christ. Now, you as the listener might be thinking that this sounds a little bit dangerous, but you'll be happy to know that the Soviets thought so too. And that's why they engineered the Rorschach with 2 failsafe systems to prevent any kind of disaster. The first failsafe was that each Rorschach was built like a 2-stage rocket. When the satellite was done its mission, the upper half containing the reactor would separate and use its own thrusters to boost itself into a safe, faraway graveyard orbit. If you don't know what a graveyard orbit is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just an orbit far away from Earth where people throw anything they don't want to deal with. And eventually it'll either burn up safely or it'll be a problem for later generations. The second failsafe was actually a lot more fun. In case the first system failed, or even just whenever it properly reached a safe orbit, the satellite would simply eject the reactor core, firing it off into deep space. The problem with this was that it only separated the reactor and not the reactor coolant, which resulted in every Rorschach venting its radioactive liquid metal coolant into orbit in a spray of sodium-potassium alloy. And these clouds are still up there in large part. Like this is a, yeah, it is radioactive. Every satellite blows its radioactive load, and there are still clouds of this going around. Like this is a hallmark of being in space now, is dodging the swarm of radioactive liquid metal droplets.
You have to deal with the scrap and remnants of rocket booster parts, like screws or rivets
Smashed
or something,
satellites,
smashed satellites,
lost cosmonauts.
Yeah, lost cosmonaut or 2, garbage. And then you also have to contend with radioactive goop that is also congealing somewhere in the atmosphere.
I picture it as being like, when you're on a long road trip and you hit you like a bug smushes itself against your the window of your car. I picture it like that, except it just starts like glowing green across the whole front of your spacecraft.
Your DNA just starts to turn into spaghetti.
It just starts curdling. Yeah. With all of those fail safes, there's no way anything could possibly go wrong, right? Right?
No, absolutely not. The scientists assured me, Khrushchev, that nothing could go wrong.
Oh, it's not Khrushchev by this point.
The spirit of Khrushchev has been assured. Nothing will go wrong.
It has been... Cosmos 954, the topic of our episode, launched into orbit on September 18th, 1977. It was the 18th Rorschach, and by this time the program was, pretty well established. The first Rorschach launched a full 12 years earlier in 1965 as Cosmos 102. And the Soviets didn't launch these things, they didn't launch them gradually to try and build up a network. They launched them close together in batches.
I was going to say, they just started blasting them out there. They just had them borderline assembly style.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And even with the nuclear reactors, these satellites flew at such low altitudes that, they only ever lasted a few months. By the time Cosmos 954 launched, the longest a Rorschach had ever functioned was 74 days.
Back up 74 days for a satellite.
Yeah. Because, again,
Holy
these things
shit.
are... As we'll talk about later in this episode, these things are they are satellites, but they're in a weird gray zone between aerodynamics and space and orbital mechanics. If these things were any lower, they would need to have wings. These things are plowing through the upper atmosphere, and they are slowing down hard because of it. And the only reason for that is because the radar tech wasn't there at the time, so the only way they could make out small US ships was to basically have this satellite hovering, 20 meters above their head. Yeah, so because of this, because they launched them in batches to kind of build up a short network instead of having a long-term one like GPS or GLONASS, Galileo, Baidu, any of those big networks that last a long time. Because of this, for a few months at a time, the Soviet radar web was either weakened or outright non-existent. And part of this was because the Soviets actually built a stash of these satellites then they had them in a warehouse at a launch facility, because they knew that if war were to break out, the first thing that would happen is every satellite in orbit would get nuked. So their idea was wait for war to happen, every satellite gets knocked out, and then they are able to quickly launch a bunch of replacement Rorsats into orbit and have their missile have their radar web up and running right away. And so normally at the end of their missions, the satellites would do the whole graveyard orbit core ejection thing and just let the radar burn up. Anyway, our satellite, 954, successfully reached its target orbit and began operation without any hitches for about a month.
Oh, just a month.
Yeah. Sometime in late October, we don't actually know when, the Soviets lost control of their nuclear satellite. Its orbit started to decay and it slowly lost altitude. Without direct control, it also started tumbling uncontrollably. Now, you might be thinking this would be a great time to fire up one of those failsafe systems the Soviets had built into their satellite. After all, other Rorsats they'd actually failed in their missions sooner, and they'd been able to still get their uranium far away from Earth. Here's the problem. Those systems had to be triggered manually.
Oh.
Yeah. In every other flight, the Soviet scientists, they had to decide when a Rorsat's mission was done. They had to hit the red button, and they commanded it to dump its reactor. They never anticipated a situation where the satellite would just completely cut out. And so none of 954's failsafes were, they couldn't activate automatically. The satellite didn't know, it wasn't able to decide for itself when it was fucked. And because of this, none of 954's failsafes ever activated, and it'd stay in one piece until it deorbited. And oh boy, did it deorbit.
So you're telling me that at no point during that deorbiting process that somebody could have told it, hey, 954, stop that. You're being silly.
Or better yet, I can guarantee you this wasn't just, the satellite suddenly started to deorbit. There was a lead-up period. There's a period where people probably tried to get confirmation that the satellite was going down. Do we have contact with this satellite?
So what happened, from the research I've done, and it is all very patchy because as we'll talk about, the Soviets were not very forthcoming with their notes. This is not one of the examples of where things got released and declassified in the 90s, because this was the Soviet Navy's top secret stuff. My understanding of what happened with the satellite is that they lost, the first thing that happened was they lost communications. The thing, the screens all went black. The deorbiting happened after that because it no longer had active control. So there wasn't a slow buildup of problems. They just woke up one morning and they had no contact with the thing.
Because
they had no contact with the thing, and because they had no contact, they couldn't tell it to get rid of its huge hunk of nuclear material.
No one could have foreseen this.
This is a problem that no one could ever possibly have prepared for or dealt with. I think we can say that the Soviets are blameless.
The American Reaction and Nest.
Now, the Americans, to their credit, they almost immediately noticed the Soviet military satellite was spinning wildly out of control. They had entire dedicated systems.
Limited reaction does not sound good.
We'll get to that. So they noticed right away. They had dedicated systems and teams for tracking anything the Soviets launched. But crucially, they did not know what 954 was. And they also didn't know what it was carrying. They just treated it like a normal satellite and went through all the standard bureaucratic steps. They spotted the satellite in November. They convened a committee in December, and they predicted that the satellite would re-enter and burn up sometime in the next year. And that's just how they left it. It's just another piece of space junk. It took the Soviets until early July 1958, so a solid 3 to 4 months later, to admit to the US that they'd lost control of their satellite. Hey there, folks. Quinn Editing and Post here. Just want to make a quick correction because I got the date wrong on both counts. It was January 1978 that the Soviets admitted that their satellite was out of control. All right, back to the show. And so there's precedent and regulation around this. Since nations actually share space, they generally let each other know when a satellite has gone rogue, because no one wants to be liable if your broken satellite like slams into a space station or deorbits over a city. And 954 was a special case because it carried a load of nuclear fuel. While a satellite collision could lead to some embarrassment on the world stage and you having to pay some fines, a hunk of uranium falling from orbit could easily be viewed as an act of war. Now, that does not mean the Soviets were helpful. The Vorsats were military satellites that were like essential to the Soviet Navy's battle plans, so they had to keep their secrets. They did not say what 954 did. They gave only basic details on its shape and size, and they refused to elaborate on anything to do with the nuclear fuel or how much the satellite held. The only thing they did give details on was how the satellite was turbo specially designed to burn up completely, that there was no risk of any nuclear fuel reaching the ground, and that there was definitely no risk of the satellite exploding in a nuclear fireball.
So you mean that as long as it discharged its fuel into a graveyard orbit, that there was no chance that it would ever deposit radioactive waste upon the planet Earth?
No chance,
right?
That our perfectly safe, non-military application satellite is containing a disastrously large amount of uranium fuel that has been enriched beyond weapons grade. Like, no
literally
chance,
to weapons
no
grade.
chance that this could possibly happen. No chance that it will deorbit above a major city and explode violently. No chance whatsoever. So
as you've kind of been alluding to there, if you're wondering about the part about it not exploding, it's because the Soviet scientists tracking the satellite thought there was a very real risk that the satellite might explode. And by explode, I don't just mean like break. I mean that the nuclear fuel inside of it could reach fission and like explode in a nuclear explosion.
This isn't a satellite. This is a bomb. It was made in a bomb factory.
That's why the Soviets were so worried and telling people, because it's like, imagine if an airburst nuclear bomb went off over the US, it would be World War III within 5 minutes.
Now imagine if we didn't tell anyone about it and just let them assume the worst, and then it happened.
I mean, there's 2 space powers at this time. They'd know who it was. If it's not us, it's them. It's because they thought there was a very real risk that the satellite might explode. And for this, I'm going to have to quickly explain some nuclear physics and the concept of critical mass. So put simply, critical mass is the minimum amount of a fissile material you need for it to sustain a nuclear reaction by itself. If you pile enough of a material together to reach its critical mass, it will start doing nuclear stuff without any assistance. This is where, like, there are some examples of natural nuclear reactors in nature, just like a amount of uranium the water is flowing through and it comes out warmer on the other side. Now, the critical mass of uranium-235 is around 47 kilos. And if you'll remember, Cosmos 954 carried around 45 kilos of U-235. So that's less than the critical mass. This should mean it was safe. It doesn't matter what you do. If it's less than 47 kilos, it won't sustain a reaction. And that'd be true, except for the fact that there is a very easy way to lower the critical mass of an element. If a chunk of uranium is below the critical mass, it's still decaying and releasing neutrons and stuff. It's just that most of those neutrons are escaping and flying off instead of hitting other uranium atoms and thus continuing the reaction. But if you surround the fuel in what's called a neutron reflector, you can rebound those neutrons back at the fuel and artificially make a smaller mass of uranium go critical. This is a very common practice in nuclear reactors because it lets you use less fuel for more energy. And the term for that is called reflector savings. Like a lot of reactors, Cosmos 954 had neutron reflectors. It actually had 6 of them. They were these big beryllium rods. It could be moved up and down around the reactor to sort of fine-tune its energy output. The concern of the Soviet scientists was that the combination of re-entry heat and the neutron reflectors possibly being locked in the deployed position might be enough to push 954's reactor over the edge. Now, let me be clear, this cannot happen. High temperature cannot take a subcritical lump of uranium and make it go boom. And the Soviets were pretty sure of this as well, but you can understand why they'd be a little worried. Maybe they want to be on the safe side. And because they were worried, they told the Americans that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. And the Soviets insisting that everything was fine only convinced the Americans that the satellite had a very real risk of exploding. Have you guys ever seen that Monty Python skit where it's like the pilots who are bored on an airliner and they start going over the radio like everything is fine, the wings are not on fire.
Yes.
And just like freaking everyone out. It's basically that. Like the Soviets start saying that everything is fine, and that just makes the US go crazy because they can tell like, oh, they're lying to us. Everything is not fine. So all of this made Cosmos 954 a very big deal to the US, as you can understand. It also made the upcoming re-entry a nuclear accident, and thus the territory of a little-known group in the American Department of Energy called NEST, or the Nuclear Emergency Support Team. Have you ever heard of these guys?
I mean, okay, yeah, of course I heard of them initially through a novel, I guess.
All right. So now you might be thinking this is a good turn in our story, right? We get a team of specialists whose whole job is to respond to nuclear accidents. They got billions of dollars of DOE funding behind them, and they've even got a cool acronym, right?
If I may interrupt, the problem is that they were summoned in the first place.
And I'm going to talk about how they did not have any of those things. So NEST was formed in 1974 after a particularly embarrassing event for the US government. An extortionist threatened to nuke Boston with a hidden bomb if the US government didn't pay him. You want to guess how much he asked for?
$5 million.
$200,000. Which for context, in today's dollars, that's a little over $1 million for nuking a city.
He ransomed the city of Boston for $200,000.
$200,000.
Here's the plan. We get the warhead and we hold the world ransom for $1 million.
Just like, I'd like to buy a home.
And that's the craziest part about that is at that point in time, that's maybe what, 5-6 homes in Boston?
Yeah.
Like for that.
Well, think about it. If he gets the money, then he can buy a home in Boston. If he has to nuke Boston, then there's so much more real estate has just opened up.
The property values will drop. It's easy. It's an easy win for him.
Exactly.
He can buy the city of Boston for $200,000 if he destroys it all.
It's a crater now. I live here.
Wait a second. I'm close enough to Boston where I could become a casualty of this. Hold up.
Well, don't worry, because you'll be happy to know the government didn't respond to the ransom letter, but it actually did believe that there was a bomb, and they put together a crack team of nuclear experts to find it and prevent a crisis. The clock was ticking, and over 500,000 lives were on the line. If that sounds like an action movie trailer, that's because that's definitely how the US government wanted to present the response. In real life, it was probably closer to a Three Stooges skit. So first off, just because these guys were nuclear experts, it doesn't mean they knew anything about criminals or tracking radiation or even disarming bombs. They just grabbed whoever looked sort of smart and worked at the Atomic Energy Commission. It's just like, yeah, it's like literal Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan stuff where it's like, oh, he's a CIA analyst and now he's a spy. He's completely fish out of water story. They just grab nuclear scientists and throw them into Boston.
So that means he can totally track nuclear radiation from miles away.
You're like
away,
a bloodhound
right?
for it, right? You know what it smells like.
Does the air suddenly taste like metal within 100 feet of your
can just
person?
driving around in their
lick your
truck with
finger,
their
hold it up to
redometer.
the air, and if it starts glowing. But they did have equipment, at least. They had an entire plane load of specialized high-power radiation detectors, and they were sent to the wrong airport. So the experts got there with no clue how to start and no equipment. And this is also all meant to be secret. They did not tell anyone in Boston. They didn't tell even Boston officials about what they believed to be a hidden nuclear bomb that they had no intention of paying the ransom for. So what these dudes wound up doing was renting local panel vans, loading them with store-bought Geiger counters, and just driving around Boston hoping to pick something up. It's awesome. And okay, so long story short, the threats, like, they turn out to be empty. There was never any bomb. It was just some dude trying to get some money. But, like, you have to understand, the US government took this seriously. They took it seriously, and that was their response, was to just have a dude in, like, a U-Haul truck waving a Geiger counter around and just hoping to pick up the bomb.
We took it so seriously that we did not take the necessary precautions to ensure that the equipment arrived at the correct airport.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of airports. It's easy to get it mixed up.
So what's amazing about that is you have a governmental body that is by far and away concerned. And that's weird for a governmental body. And they have decided that they are going to enact surveillance upon this area. And now, do they actually decide to perform this correctly? Yes or no? Shocker.
No.
Imagine if the bomb went off. You let them nuke us for $200,000.
Yeah, like guys, like I'm sorry, there was nothing else we can do. We sent our top men on this case. they were right there in Boston in that panel.
For a hot second, you are a terror, or you are a I don't know, terrorist, non-uniform combatant, whatever you want to refer to yourself as.
I think terrorist works here. He was trying to terrify the government into giving him money.
There's so many definitions. I'm not getting into that.
But
whatever. Either way, you are rolling into this area. You are setting up. You are giving this ultimatum, money or boom. And all you see suddenly for days on end are white, nondescript panel vans rolling
you
around.
Expect to see you expect to see black helicopters, and instead you see dudes in sweaty dudes in lab coats with metal detectors.
Are you kidding? One of those is even worse. So fun. Sorry to branch off into personal things, but I distinctly remember at an air show that I went to that a group of RVs, someone happened to take a photo that was picked up by sensors. This happened to be in Rhode Island. And the inside of this area, there was a distinct sensor that captured that not flash, but sonic pulse of a rangefinder, picked it up, and then suddenly an entire RV park was absolutely flooded with Chevy Blazers sitting suspiciously low on their shocks, and men that were gently folding you inside of your clothes into a Chevy Blazer. It is kind of hard to reconcile that with this approach.
Yeah, like that's the security state of now. This was the security state of then.
So welcome to the 70s. Was it 70s or 80s?
This was late 70s. This is in 70. This is late 70s.
Okay, I thought I had it correct. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, this was in January of 78 at this point. Thankfully, the threats turned out to be empty. There was never any bomb, and the extortionist was just trying to make a quick buck. But the panicked response was so uncoordinated that they figured if the bomb was real, they wouldn't have found it, and it would have flattened Boston. So all of this convinced President Ford that the U.S. needed a team of experts dedicated just to responding to nuclear threats and accidents. The year was 1974, and this team would be NEST. NEST spent the next 3 years also failing to respond to fake nuclear threats. I'm not going to say they were bad at their jobs. The last team set the bar way too low for that. And they certainly didn't seem to have many big wins. Maybe it was just slim pickings for nuclear disasters, especially when you consider that the big name disasters like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl would only happen in 79 and 86, respectively. But then this also leads to the classic government thing where, because they didn't get many wins, people didn't think they were important, which meant they didn't get any funding or equipment. It's exactly like pandemic responses where everyone was like, why don't any of these programs have any funding? Well, it's because no one thought there was going to be a pandemic, so they didn't give it to them.
It's because there wasn't a pandemic that there wasn't.
No one thinks a disaster can happen until it happens.
Yes.
And then they wonder why it wasn't prevented.
It's because foresight's only as great as the person you're able to convince.
It's the scenario of your technology needs are being satisfied currently and nothing is on fire, so you decide to slash your technology team budget and fire your IT guy, and then everything breaks because he was keeping everything working in the background,
because you want to
just because you don't see the problem doesn't mean it's not there. It's just being taken care of.
And not being actively prevented.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm in the middle of that right now.
Yeah, so like we were saying, NEST, they wound up in that problem. By the time the Soviets lost contact with Cosmos 954, NEST was a handful of scientists working out of a small building in Las Vegas. And they were also in a sort of political limbo, because whenever NEST was created in 1974, it was part of what was then the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC. And you can probably guess from the name that this group focused exclusively on managing America's nuclear power and weapons. But in late 1977, the Department of Energy was created to sort of consolidate all of America's energy organizations. Because back then they had one for atomics, they had one for wind, one for like every different kind of power generation had its own government agency. So they took the DOE, they created the DOE, and they just crammed all of these organizations together.
Nice.
Yeah, which like on the one hand, it works out in the long run. I can understand why you do it. But cramming all of them together under central management meant that at least in the early months, there was a lot of confusion. People didn't know who worked for who. They didn't, like, the processes weren't all synced up. Like, these organizations did not play nice at first. The newborn Department of Energy and its leadership were left in charge of a lot of small groups they didn't really know how to use. Like, NEST definitely fell into this category. Now, these problems would eventually be ironed out over time. But remember, the Soviets lost control of Cosmos 954 in October of 1977, which is exactly the same month that the Department of Energy opened their doors. Like, eventually, they would eventually sort all of this out, but like, this is happening at exactly the right time that no one knows how to respond to it. And the only people who do know how to respond to it, their bosses have forgotten they exist. And they're not getting any funding.
Don't care.
Well, they also don't know at this point because NORAD and NASA aren't talking to them because they also don't know who NEST is, because NEST is in a small building in Las Vegas. Like, none of these groups are talking to each other, and because of that, their response is incredibly either lackluster or uncoordinated.
Nest calls up NORAD for support, and NORAD is like, "Who the hell are you? How did you get this phone number?"
Yeah, exactly.
Which is kind of weird considering that NORAD is mostly concerned with nuclear strikes upon the United States.
Yeah,
what is
but this
NEST
is also
concerned with?
NEST is primarily concerned with cleanup and coordination of nuclear disasters.
So what if we were to have
one of the first big wins for NEST, or I don't believe it was NEST at this point, but like a lot of the people who became part of NEST started off, they got their experience on, I believe it was Hobo 12, which was a B-52 bomber that crashed somewhere in Greenland. And it crashed with a whole bunch of nuclear warheads that they had to find and dig up.
Because they had, 4 of them?
I can't remember the exact numbers, but yeah.
I think 4 bombers as usual. And
a bunch of them were recovered fine. One of them had to be like painstakingly chipped out of a block of ice. Because it was like cracked.
But either way, they were dropped, and it was not a good time for anyone involved.
No. This is like a change of management, and no one knows what's going on. And it's largely because of this institutional paralysis that when the Soviets finally admitted the satellite carried 50 kilos of weapons-grade glow rock, the American response was slow, uncoordinated, and mostly disinterested. This was also complicated by the fact that predicting when an orbit will decay is really hard. When you're dealing with speeds of well over Mach 20, a rounding error can throw your calculation off by hundreds of kilometers. Also, there is no real way for the American scientists to simulate 954. First off, the Soviets never told them what it looked like or how big it was. They reasoned that because it's a satellite in space, it didn't matter. There's no air, so there's no drag, right?
That would assume that
it's not
the
in
vacuum
space.
is... Well, also...
Not anymore.
Guess what, schmuck? That would assume that vacuum is perfect in any circumstance.
This is more of like a dirty trick on the Soviet scientists' part. Like, they obviously knew that this was not true. But this was like a little bureaucratic thing. It's in space. Why would we tell you that? Because of the incredibly low orbit the Rorschachs were designed to operate at, and because of how it was tumbling out of control, there was a lot of drag. As for what it actually looked like, 954 was basically a 15-meter long pencil. So sometimes whenever it flew straight into the wind, there was no drag. There was very little drag. And sometimes whenever it was tumbling, it flew sideways, slamming into the air with massive drag. So any model that NASA or NORAD made to try and simulate when this thing would come down is immediately worthless because it's spinning all over the place. Its drag is changing at all times, and they don't know how it's spinning. When NASA scientists crunched the numbers, they confidently declared that 954 would re-enter the atmosphere sometime between April and June 1978. To give you an idea of NASA's attitude, I'm going to quote from Operation Morning Light. Quote, the computers calculated that the chances of Cosmos hitting a landmass were only 1 in 12. Indeed, one computer even figured the possibility was 1 in a million. A harmless landing in the sea was the consensus. So, like, at first, the U.S. interest in 954 is basically like a sine wave, because at first they're like, oh, it's a boring satellite, I don't care. And then they find out it has uranium in it, and they start caring. And then NASA tells them that it's going to hit the ocean in like 6 to 7 months, and they don't care again. So, like, everyone in the U.S. government, from NASA to NORAD to NEST new bosses at the AEC, suddenly thought that 954 wasn't too big a deal. Sure, it carried nuclear fuel, but the rocket scientists said that they had 6 months to prepare. It would probably burn up, and if it didn't burn up, it would probably just land in an ocean anyway. Despite all of this, the heroes of our stories, the scientists at NEST, were still taking 954 seriously. They seemed to be the only people who realized that any guesses about 954's orbit were exactly that, guesses, and that the satellite could drop anywhere from a month to a year in the future, and literally anywhere on Earth at this point. They also thought that a 1 in 12 chance of the satellite hitting the ground was still a very good reason to be alarmed, and they had one big reason for this: nuclear proliferation.
Someone could loot the fallen satellite of its uranium stores.
Or better yet, congratulations. What happens if if that satellite at a sufficient altitude happened to, I don't know, pop over a city, or in a trajectory that a city might be suddenly, sufficiently sprinkled with, I don't know, what was it, 54 kilograms of super enriched
around 45.
Sorry, 45.
So it's 50. I need to be clear. It's 50 kilos total, but it's 90% U-235. So it's 45 kilos of the good stuff,
so
and 5% kilos of the bad stuff.
We're talking about the fresh flake off board.
Oh, we're talking about that good yellow cake.
Yeah, that good shit. That, 45 kilos of which, if on the wrong trajectory, is going to drop the mother of all holy hells on a city.
Yeah. So I know you've been on a roll recently.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to tell you that no, this is good. I'm just going to tell you that Chris was more right about this than you were. Because he was talking about someone looting that shit. And while contamination was a big worry, this is something that only NEST actually realized and figured out. Because remember,
NEST was tricked the first time, and now they're really worried it's going to be real. Someone's going to loot this for real, and then we'll have a real bomb next time someone threatens to take $200,000 from the federal government.
And that's the thing. If you consider it, if that bomb breaks over a city, how much is it to hire, I don't know, a fucking subway rat, or just, someone who's disadvantaged enough in life? Hey, that rock that hurts to touch, can you put it right here for me? Okay, thanks. You repeat that enough times, and you have, I don't know, enough fissile material, not to create a nuclear bomb, but enough that, say, you had, I don't know,
they could make a dirty bomb out of that.
Another thing that you're also wrong with. I'm not gloating with this, but like, they did have if they found it, they could have enough to make a bomb, a real one. Not even like a dirty bomb, certainly, but like they could make a real one. Remember when I said 954 was carrying literal weapons grade uranium? It turns out making a nuclear bomb is actually very easy. Basically, all you need is a tube and some dynamite. From Operation Morning Light. Quote, the day of the homemade atomic bomb became a reality in 1977 when John Aristotle Phillips, a Princeton undergraduate, designed one as a project for his physics class. In the same year, Mechanics Illustrated published an article showing how it could be done. NEST was understandably nervous on the subject. All someone needed to build a nuclear weapon was a small quantity of enriched uranium-235, the same material Cosmos carried in its reactor. So, like, you, as the only people who have figured this out, they're worried about some kid finding a lump of uranium and building a bomb in their garage. Look,
Mom,
Chris, you were right. Like, doing the Boston thing.
They're sending us presents, Mom. Look, from Russia with love.
Yeah, radioactive burning hunks of love.
Nest is worried about, like, if someone finds this, especially with the last, like, the Boston scare, they are worried about a nuclear Boston bombing that could realistically happen if someone recovered this stuff.
The problem with, any civilian making a bomb is that there are two main types of bomb design, and I fully expect you to just cut this, is that you have a gun type design, which is the most common for a simple bomb. So you have your main fissile mass, then you have
you got a donut in a hole for it, and you fire. Yeah, like that is what they, especially like this kid. I'm pretty sure now he's like the head of a hedge. Like, he's a billionaire. He's the head of a hedge fund. This is how he initially got famous. This guy named John Aristotle Phillips.
You think
it was a basic gun type, which is just a tube, some dynamite to fire it, and it slams the two pieces of uranium, and they go boom.
And they have the horror moment. Yes. The other one is the classical type of non-critical mass.
The implosion.
Yeah. Explosive lenses, all of that good stuff.
Right, and this is not like, that is something generally considered beyond,
but still,
like,
a gun
civilian
type
stuff.
is a thing.
Yeah, like, and that would have been more than enough to take with the material Cosmos had. That would have been more than enough to make it go boom. Nest soldiered on alone, preparing equipment and running cleanup drills for the looming disaster that they and seemingly no one else was worried about. But the rest of the U.S. government not caring didn't stop Nest officials from making a lot of noise. By early January 1958, they had even convinced the CIA to devote some of its tracking stations to the rogue satellite. And do you want to guess what happened when the new data came in?
Surprise! It's not going to land in the ocean anymore.
Sort of, yeah. Because
I'm going to have to guess that the CIA went completely and utterly insane.
Cosmos 954 has pirouetted its way into a new trajectory that's going to land it somewhere in Canada.
It's gonna land right in Moscow, been nudged by some unseen satellite. But yeah, you are kind of right. From Operation Morning Light, quote, even though there was still no way of knowing where the satellite would come down, the date of impact had moved up dramatically. Cosmos was not going to crash in April or June, but within a matter of days, sometime in the last week of January. So this goes from them having like 6 months to prepare to them having like less than 2 weeks. This is like another Sputnik 2 thing. Like, NASA runs the numbers and says, like, guys, we're fine. It's going to land in the water. The CIA runs the numbers and finds, like, hey, it's going to hit the land and it's going to do it next week.
How long is it between these two number crunchings?
So the earlier NASA number crunching, that was based on the preliminary before they knew it was nuclear. So that would have been sometime in like November, December of 1977. And this is like Nest gets the CIA to do this like right after the Soviets admit that it's carrying nuclear materials.
Yeah, so like how long has passed?
Like NASA is continuously doing number crunchings. So like between the most recent to the CIA, probably like 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, like I don't know what changed between their numbers, but just the fact that like suddenly the re-entry date has moved up a lot.
No,
like, we need to be worried.
It is to be taken into account, though, if they did not know how much fissile mass was on board, just because of the fact that the density would change.
Yes.
And a dense mass interacting with atmosphere tend to generate much more drag. Just because of the fact that it's going to dive deeper.
And also, like, that is another point in what we talked about, where any model that the US makes, whether it's NASA, NORAD, or the CIA, any model they can come up with is immediately useless because they do not know enough about this satellite. And even if they knew everything about the satellite, the fact that it's tumbling out of control and that they don't know how it's tumbling means that, like, its drag is going all over the place. It's at this point that the US government decided to let the leaders of the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada in on the secret. This wasn't just to give them the courtesy of knowing that uranium might be soon raining down on their countries. America only had so many tracking stations, and as the clock ticked down to re-entry day, it became more and more important and more realistic to predict where the satellite might land. So all these countries started cooperating, having scientists watch the satellite over different parts of the sky and come up with different models to like compare and contrast. But this is all still academic. The data got more precise the closer to re-entry the satellite got. But that also left governments with less and less time to actually use that data and react to it. Less time for preparations, less time for evacuations, which brings me to another point. We have a situation where a bunch of governments know about what they think is an impending disaster, one that could even be like, at worst, an airburst nuclear bomb. They don't know how bad it'll be. 954, it could burn up in the atmosphere or hit the ground. It could even explode in a nuclear fireball. They know roughly when it'll happen, but not where. Question for the hosts. If you're a leader in one of those disaster movies like 2012 or Don't Look Up, and you find out about an impending disaster, do you tell your people?
No, of course not.
Of course
because
not.
Of money.
You're a good politician.
Because money. It might hurt the economy. We can't have them leave.
It might hurt the economy.
Everyone has to
There'd
go
be
to
a
work.
panic, and
Everyone has to go to
might,
work. We need the tax dollars. If people
we
don't work,
we need the tax dollars to build our new bunkers.
If people
that we,
don't
the
pay
government,
their
will
tax
escape
dollars,
to.
the economy line goes down, and that's going to hurt my chances of getting reelected.
Yeah.
It's almost as if a large group of people could potentially act in a very stupid manner, which very well might happen.
Like any good politicians, every country that knew about 954 opted to keep it from their citizens. So while governments and any preparations that they did were also kept secret, and they did wind up doing some like evacuation drills and things like that. They just never told anyone about it. So while governments ran secret evacuation drills, scientists around the world were watching Cosmos 954 and running the numbers, getting better results each time. Finally, on January 24th, NORAD announced the satellite would re-enter at exactly 3:56 a.m. Pacific Standard Time and would impact in the Canadian Northwest Territories. And I think that is a good place to end this episode. So next time, we will be talking about the actual crash of Cosmos 954, as well as the response from the American and Canadian governments.
The strategically placed cliffhanger.
Exactly.
Everyone's favorite.
How do you guys all feel about that now?
I need to know more.
Oh, you will. We will all learn more about this in the next episode. But like, how do you feel? How do you feel about Cosmos the satellite? How do you feel about our
stricken pencil,
our new
friends?
Favorite pencil full of uranium?
Yeah. That's
yes, another hateful thing.
That's it's unnerving.
Yeah,
it is honestly another betrayal of just. Number one, I am very pro nuclear power, but just the way that it is used here is in no good taste.
Oh, yeah.
The ultimate worst case scenario, just, 73 days and then fling it into a graveyard orbit. And then...
Yeah. And even whenever they work, like these things are, like a graveyard orbit, like we talked about, is basically just saying... this will be someone else's problem. It doesn't go away.
It doesn't matter what. So, congratulations. You're ejecting the massive graveyard orbit. What about everything else left behind? That's not radioactive.
No. And as we'll get to in the next episode, like whenever the satellite comes down, it's not just the fuel. Like the rest of the satellite, every other component of the satellite is pretty heavily irradiated, both by like stellar radiation and just the fact that it's been sitting inside a nuclear reactor.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.